All right, welcome everyone. I'm Janeen Bertsche Johnson, and I welcome you to Third Thursdays. So glad that you could join us today. Today, our speaker will be David Boshart, our president, who will be reflecting on his recent sabbatical experience. He was on sabbatical for the months of July, August, and September. And he has shared a bit about that here at AMBS. And so I'm building on some of what I've heard from him to ask some questions. You also will have the chance to ask questions. If you would like to do that, you can use the Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And you can just type your questions in there, and I'll be watching for those. If you have any other issues during the webinar, you can send your questions to the webinar host, Faven, who is helping us, and she will assist you. If you would like to introduce yourself to the others who are here, you can use the chat feature to do that. Make sure you send that to everyone, because then everyone will see it and not just the panelists. So you might want to say who you are and what years you were at AMBS and where you are now. So welcome to everyone. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
I know sabbaticals are a treasured experience, and I'm going to start off with some questions about the reading you did, because I know you read a lot of books while you were on sabbatical, or at least that was a significant portion. So start off by telling us about a reading that touched you personally.
Good question. Well, I would say there were two specific ones that really were personal to me. One was Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. We had relocated for my sabbatical to Iowa, near where our children and grandchildren live. And in that book, Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about what's happening for adolescents. And my oldest grandchild is turning 15. And so there is a really meaningful and poignancy to reading his book, which talks a lot about the anxiety that adolescents are experiencing in our country, particularly through their exposure to social media. And I found that to be just a really meaningful thing to read as I was reconnecting with our grandkids in a special way. I also read the book Circle of Hope, a reckoning with love, power, and justice in an American church, which is a powerful and profound case study of the Circle of Hope Church in Philadelphia. It was a Brethren in Christ church originally, and a place where people like Shane Claiborne attended when he was in college. And it was a sort of a beautiful story, and also a very painful story in terms of what happened in that church, and often reflects, I think, many of the dynamics we see playing out in Mennonite Church USA. So it was a great concentrated case study of issues and dynamics that are going on in wider denominations as well.
And you also read a book by an AMBS graduate, Werner Franz, called Business Ethics Rooted in the Church. What new perspectives came to you from his book?
Well, Werner was invited to this community this summer. Actually, AMBS was a co-sponsor of a MDiv event, inviting Werner to come from Paraguay. He's a former seminary president in Paraguay, but also was really integrally involved in the Sorona Dairy Project, which was the first MDiv project. The Sorona Dairy is now the largest producer of milk products in the country of Paraguay and exports all around the world. So it's a wonderful success story. Werner did his dissertation for his PhD on entrepreneurship and John Howard Yoder's 5 practices of the church before the watching world, body politics. And so his dissertation was all about connecting body politics to the question of where can business and entrepreneurship intersect with the ways we're bringing or bearing witness to our Christian faith through business endeavors. So it was great to read that. And I was also a keynote presenter at the MDiv convention here a couple of weeks ago, and also did a workshop with Steve Brenneman, a friend here in the community, on entrepreneurship as spiritual vocation. And so Werner's dissertation was really insightful in helping me prepare for these events here recently.
That's great. And were there any particular readings that spoke to how AMBS might be forming leaders.
Hmm.
Maybe some that you've already mentioned, but
Right. So I think Werner's book is bringing a question to me related to how can AMBS be speaking more to the business community and to more entrepreneurial leaders. I might say more about that later, depending on where you go with your questions around the future of the church as a where we are often kind of talking about seeding the future to ongoing decline and division and disintegration. Are there ways in which the church and the business community need to be better partners with each other to think about a hopeful future? So Werner's book was really helpful in that. The other thing that I read that I didn't plan to read is a dissertation by a scholar in Indonesia who is a close associate of Paulus Wijaya, one of our alums. He's on the faculty at Duta Wacana University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And he gave me his dissertation, which I read on the plane home. It's just utterly fascinating. He's doing intertextual and interfaith and intercultural work. His dissertation advisor was Hans de Wit in Amsterdam. And he did this comparison of the story of Jacob's wrestling with God alongside an indigenous myth story, folk story in Indonesia. And he mapped the arc of these two quest stories. But he went to a category that we often don't work with in our exegesis here, and that was the whole element of mysticism as an aspect of that story. And so remember, we're in the East, not the West, when we're in Indonesia. And so here was this very Eastern perspective on the story of Jacob that I just found utterly fascinating and would love to see more conversation going on between this scholar and let's see, his name was Daniel, between him and our faculty to get a little more East-West integration in our reading of the text.
that's wonderful. A sabbatical also includes many opportunities to talk with people, and you especially had some opportunities to meet with pastors. And I'm curious,
Mm.
what in those conversations is standing out for you that stays with you? Um, and how might the experiences and perspectives that those pastors were sharing with you impact your vision for AMBS now?
Right. So I did have a wonderful opportunity to connect with pastors while I was on sabbatical. The week before my sabbatical began, no one on our development staff was able to represent AMBS at the Central Plains Mennonite Conference annual gathering, where I used to be the executive. And so they asked me if I would be willing to do that. And so it was my first time to go back to an annual meeting of Central Plains Conference, and for 5 years here. And I was delighted by a number of invitations that came my way for when I got back to the community for my sabbatical from younger pastors, and not necessarily young pastors, but pastors younger than me, to sit and talk, and then also engaged in some conversations with pastors across the US, and then also in Indonesia when I was there on a short teaching assignment in September. I turned 60 while I was on sabbatical, and I found myself increasingly well, that was a moment of reflection on my sabbatical. But I was also increasingly finding myself sitting with younger pastors in almost the elder, I don't know, statesman or elder role. And I was intrigued by how many younger pastors were wanting to sit and talk with someone who has longer experience, looking for reassurance, validation, encouragement, and was delighted to be able to provide that in some of those conversations. I think our pastors, especially younger pastors, are really facing some big questions about their role in the church and what the future of the church really is. One of the things I became aware of in these conversations, and this is all anecdotal, but I wonder to what extent it's in the milieu of the church broadly, and that is the number of churches that are shifting their leadership models and the decline in the number of full-time pastors we're seeing in churches, which may be a very good thing. There certainly advantages to that, but there are also some, I think, unintended consequences. And one of those is that where I saw pastors moving from full-time to part-time status in congregations, I found that the relationship between the pastor and the congregation is becoming more transactional in nature. That is, if I'm no longer full-time, then here's a list of services I'm providing for the church, and it's unreasonable for you to expect more of that from me. And one of the unintended consequences in that is that we're not asking the question, then who is stewarding the overall vision and mission of the church if a lead pastor isn't doing that? Now that can happen in many different ways and in many different models. But I think this is a question that isn't getting focused on in this shift that's happening in many places. And I've observed that in some cases, pastors themselves are sort of seeing the handwriting on the wall that their church isn't going to be able to sustain them as a full-time leader very long. And so they're making the choice to actually move to half-time. And sometimes that comes with other opportunities that are presenting themselves. So this would be a good time for me to go half-time. But in a couple of cases, I've observed where pastors are going down to a half-time role in the church and actually taking full-time positions outside the church. And I think there's a whole other question that needs to be asked when that's happening. And I think this also is related, this who's tending to the broader vision of the church also relates to the question of is there a way that we can be equipping pastors better at AMBS to not just be giving in to this idea that the future of the church is going to be ongoing disintegration and division and deterioration, disintegration, but what will stem the tide of that? Is that what God wants for our church? And if not, then what kinds of formation do we need to be doing here at the seminary to be stemming the tide of that kind of visioning, so that we're imagining something that can be, I don't know, it's necessarily growing our churches bigger, but a more hopeful and more impactful vision and witness for our churches in the world.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, this presumption of decline or ongoing decline. What are some of the thoughts you have given to this so far in terms of what can shift here?
Well, I think that the way that conversation or that projection gets shifted is not a problem that the seminary can solve by itself. It requires an engagement with our sponsoring denominations and with our accrediting agency, with sociologists who are talking about the future of the church. But we are seeing some consequences. It's not a direct line. It's not cause and effect, but some consequences of this ongoing conversation that the future is sort of bleak or it's heading toward greater disintegration, I think is influencing the decline in enrollment in our MDiv program. So our enrollment at AMBS is actually robust. We are growing. We've grown 70% in our enrollment over the last 5 years, and this year we sort of table off a little bit, but we're still seeing growth. But the growth is in our new programs and not the traditional Master of Divinity and Master of Arts programs. And so what's going on? That fewer people are choosing that robust, substantial professional development program and are choosing the smaller master's or certificate programs as at least starting points. Maybe that's where they start and then they go on. But it does seem like there's a hesitancy to commit to a full MDiv program these days. And what's that about? Is it not connected to this question of what is the future of the church, and can I even find my place in the future of the church? Can I imagine myself leading in a church where the dominant narrative is the church is just declining, rising secularism, the headwinds of Christian nationalism, the church is ineffectual, and if that's the case, then why would people be motivated to do what an MDiv requires, which is a pretty steep, pretty heavy lift, and to then not know, does that lead to a full-time professional position for especially younger people, or am I doing the heavy lift of an MDiv and for a part-time or even marginal time position if I'm feeling called to lead in the church?
Well, that raises a whole nother question, which is who is calling uh,
Yeah.
new people to leadership in the church in different ways, whether as pastors and other things. Um, and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves in terms of the stories of your sabbatical, but why don't you go ahead and talk about that? How would you like that question to be shaping the church? And how would you like it to be shaping AMBS? This question of
Right.
um, how do we prioritize calling and training of church leaders for this age?
Yeah, well, to anybody at AMBS and in the denominational offices, I'm a broken record on this. So forgive me if you've heard this coming from me, but it's a well-practiced script for me. And that is that everywhere I go, especially when I'm in conference settings, also congregational settings, I'm talking about the essential ministry of the church to be calling out new leaders for the future of the church. And that doesn't necessarily mean calling people who will only serve your congregation by calling them from within, although there is a trend in that direction. But a more generous perspective on that. Who is God calling in our church, and how can we support that person to answer the call of God in their lives wherever God might lead them? Churches have sort of a mercenary attitude toward the future leadership that they will need, and that is that leaders are formed somewhere else. Leaders come from somewhere else, and we call them to come to our church. Now, not that all leaders should come from within their congregation, but there is this blind spot to the fact that if everybody is expecting leaders to come from somewhere else, uh, well, we don't need to be nurturing that call here. And whenever I talk about this in conference settings, especially, I get a deer in the headlights look like, oh, like who is specifically tasked? I remember Ann Stuckey 30 years ago talking about this, that in every congregation, who is tasked with the intentional job of identifying who God is calling for church leadership in the future. And that's not just pastors, that's chaplains and leaders of nonprofit organizations in our schools who lead on behalf of the church out in the world or in places beyond the church. And it's amazing to me how often it's like, this is a new idea to people, right? And again, I think this is a problem that we can't solve as a seminary alone. This requires a full court press of denomination and conference and congregation and seminary working together. But I'm having a hard time identifying where is the priority of leadership call in the ecology of Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Church Canada. In 2004, we had a cultivating a culture of call initiative. That was 2004. I asked the question, how long is a generation? If it's 20 years, we haven't had an initiative in that direction for 20 years. That to me seems really significant. I'm sobered by that, and I'm wondering how we could be working together in this ecology to nurture that. If I might just add one anecdote, when I was pastor at West Union Mennonite Church in Parnell, Iowa, we had a process with the elders where every quarter we invited someone into the elders meeting that we sensed there was some stirring, or we sensed a particular gifting that was emerging from that person. We invited them into an interview with the elders where our question was simply, what do you sense God is doing in your life, and is there a call emerging for you? And during a 5-year period, we saw 8 people, 5 women, 3 men, nurtured to different full-time professional ministries just by asking that question. So it's not a complicated thing. It's the intentionality of where is it located within the congregation, the conference, the denomination, so that we make sure it's happening, right? And then the seminary is well prepared to receive those people to be equipped in whatever programs are appropriate for their setting in life.
Amen. I love that story. I've heard that before, and it stays with me as the kind of intentionality we need. Shifting a bit, you spent part of your sabbatical in Indonesia. You
Yeah.
even shared your shirt with us today. Lovely. You were teaching there, you were lecturing. Can you give us some of the highlights of those experiences in Indonesia?
Yeah, I had a wonderful time there. It was actually finishing something that I had hoped to do when Mennonite World Conference Assembly happened there 2 years ago. I had planned to go to these places following the assembly, and because of my father died while we were there and had to come home immediately. So 2 years later, we finally got the plan in place to be in these places. So I did a crash course in the curriculum at the Este Akawewe Seminary in Pati, which is a seminary largely made up of students that are just post-high. These are very young leaders, and I had to make quick adjustments to my teaching when I was there because I had shared my syllabus with the leaders, and they said, "Oh yeah, this is fine," but realized I was teaching a 54 students who basically had no leadership experience yet. And so there wasn't a lot of framework to hang some of the conceptual work I was doing on leadership for the church. So we made some fast changes, but I can't tell you what a delight it was to work with these 54, young people, most of whom were under 21 years of age, who every single one of them had a very clear sense of call that they were going to seminary to graduate to be a leader in the church. These young men and women were so earnest in their desire to learn, and it was just a wonderful experience. But this was sort of a post-high educational program, and so it was very rich. We did then at the end of the week a public lecture for church leaders. Many of the students were also participating in that, with two panelists from the local regional leadership groups in Indonesia, representing two of the Mennonite synods. We had about 180 folks participate in that. It was focused on missional leadership for the church. So I was setting up more theoretical, conceptual kinds of things, and then the panelists were talking about how these principles work in context. And the Indonesian Mennonite churches are strong, and I was exciting to see the strength of the synods and the congregations there. Then I traveled to Yogyakarta in southern part of Indonesia and did a public lecture at the Duta Wacana Seminary, which is a full program 4,000 student university that started as a seminary. And the Mennonite Church was one of three partners in starting that seminary and continues to be one of three founding partners for this large university. They have a teaching hospital, medical school. It's a really beautiful, well-developed, full program university. And there I was giving a lecture on leadership in complex times, and was in a very formal lecture hall that went up the stadium style seating, and they had measured me up, and here was a shirt they gave me to wear for the lecture, and there was document signing afterwards for this event. But it was a full lecture hall. Had a really great experience. In fact, a group of, it was a very ecumenical group, a group of Presbyterian pastors flew in from West Timor for the lecture. They advertised this thing widely. And lots of questions afterwards. The Q&A time went on for a long time. Lots of questions about how to be missional leaders in a context where it feels like the denominational structures are either becoming more irrelevant or disconnected from the base of the church. So it was fascinating to hear them wrestling with. My appeal was that the missional church needs to be distinctive and engaged. How is it different from the context, and how is it engaged with the context? So anyway, it was a really fun time to engage with those leaders. Yeah. It was also, I should just also say, the graduate faculty at Duta Wacana, where again our alum Paulus Wijaya, famous theologian in Indonesia, is a very large program. They have more than twice the faculty that we have, more than twice the number of students, MA through PhD. And so it was really fun to be engaging with that particular program as well while I was there.
And then at the end of your time in Indonesia, there was a consultation on theological education for Asian Mennonites. Can you tell us more about that gathering?
Wow, I was so honored to be invited to this consultation on the future of theological education in Asia. I was invited by MMN representative Andios Santoso, and MC Canada Witness leader Jeanette Hansen. They were the conveners of the gathering. There were leaders from Hong Kong, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines. I'm missing one or two here. Sorry about that. Korea and Myanmar. Half of the participants were AMBS grads, which was just really heartening to see how our grads are carrying on really important work in theological education. One of the things we know about Anabaptist identity on every continent in the world, including the US and Canada, is that the Anabaptist identity is not that strong. That the strengthening of that Anabaptist identity for leaders in their congregations is one of the most urgent needs that Mennonite World Conference has identified. For these leaders coming together around the table, it was interesting to hear them reflect on the number of theological education leadership development programs that they have offered. That it's not that theological education isn't happening, but the puzzlement is, why isn't it having more effect on the strengthening or the deepening of the Anabaptist identity? That in many places, and that's true here, these social movements, aberrant theological perspectives come through a church, and it sort of sweeps the identity of that group in that direction. And certainly Christian nationalism would be an example of that here in the US, and rising secularization in Canada. Prosperity gospel is really strong in many places in Asia. And so how can it be that we keep doing theological education programs, but we aren't seeing the deepening of this identity like it needs to be? And one of the findings of this group that I was very excited about was that our leadership education tends to be rather scatterplot. Like we throw out these webinars and these seminars, and we do a day thing, and we do a lecture here and there, but it's not sequenced or developmental. And that's something that I think a program like AMBS can speak into, and I was invited to speak into. How can we create educational programs that are developmental and sequential, so that we're actually moving people in a direction rather than just hitting them with this topic or that topic because it seems timely in the moment, right? So I was there very much as a listener. I was the only leader of an academic institution in the conversation, and it was clear I was there to accompany, not to be the expert in the room. And the expertise was certainly thick and rich with those who were around the table. But I'm excited. There's a task group now that's going to be carrying forward some work in this direction, and I'm going to be very excited to see how they work together to strengthen their theological education programs there.
That is so exciting. And I've heard you ask the question since you've been back that like, what adaptations do we need to make in our mission to educate leaders for the church in North America and around the world? I'm wondering, is that connected to these experiences at that consultation? And what else can you say about the question you're pondering now?
Yeah, that question takes me in two directions, Janeen. One has to do with what adaptations we need to make regarding the call and leadership development here in the US and Canada. And one of the things I've signaled to our board is that I'm calling for a conversation that is elevated to the governance level of the seminary and our denominations. I'm in constant conversation with the staff of Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Church Canada, Doug Clausen and Michael Danner and Glenn Guyton here, and those are really important conversations that I feel so good about. But there's only so much that we as staff to staff can do in these conversations. And what is needed is an elevated conversation at the governance level where our boards are actually in conversation with each other to say, where is the priority of call and leadership development in our ecology, in the system of our church? And so that's one adaptation. It might seem a little bit structural rather than in terms of content and program. But I think that's a missing link here in the US and Canada that needs to be strengthened, or maybe not a missing link, but an adaptation that is needed so that we can really get the call of leaders and the training of leaders more in focus for us. You know that we're a polity that has very few requirements around the educational expectations of leaders and for those getting credentialed. And that's not all bad, right? And in the mainline Protestant and Catholic world, where you have very clear requirements, educational requirements for credentialing, that hasn't solved all their problems, right? There's a shortage of leadership there, just as we have. But we need a stronger and more robust conversation at that level. In terms of connections around the world, then in the other direction, and all of these conversations for me are creating ferment in every direction, right? So like the conversation in Asia comes back here and has us thinking new thoughts. Our teaching in Ethiopia has us coming back here and thinking new thoughts about what we're doing here. I'm so grateful to be the president of AMBS when we're having this global exchange. I mean, it is so rich. But when I'm thinking about our presence in other countries, and I want to be very clear, as I say whenever I can, number one, the work we are doing is always at the invitation of a national church or an institution. We are not connected to a national church. We are not selling or vending AMBS out to the world. We are only going where we are invited, and we're working hard to enter those spaces contextually. I hear all the time at AMBS, we got to decolonize the classroom, and we don't want to be colonial in what we're doing. And the feedback I'm getting from our international partners is stop worrying about that. That's not the problem. So I'm really grateful for the feedback we're getting there. But all this to say, when we're in these contexts, it brings a challenge to us in how we're thinking about some very foundational approaches to theological education. In the US and Canada, we often talk about like critical thinking skills are so important there. That's sort of foundational to higher education, really getting in there, examining, taking things apart. Sometimes that only results in deconstruction and not enough construction, right? But critical thinking as a philosophy is based on a certain set of values. And in the West, critical thinking is very individualistic. Think for yourself. Who are you as an individual? Self-actualization and the development of the individual. But that's not the value system at the base of so many places in our world where it's much more communitarian, say Ethiopia, for example. And so there's a whole body of literature emerging in higher ed today about how critical thinking is a government mandate in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's a completely unfunded mandate. And it creates a vacuum in which Africa is importing critical thinking theory from the West, which can dismantle some basic underlying values and assumptions of a more communitarian culture. And so at AMBS, we want to be thinking about how do we enter these spaces, bringing critical thinking that doesn't dismantle or isn't hostile to some very important underlying assumptions of that culture that have been what has made that culture robust enough to survive all these thousands of years, right? So this is amazing stuff to be thinking about, but it's also extremely rich, and it's broadening our own understanding of what we're doing here when we're teaching in Elkhart, Indiana as well. Sorry, I can riff on that for a while and I need to stop.
No, I appreciate that very much. I'm going to ask a question that has come in from Naun Serato. Thank you, Naun. He says, in your presentation, you discussed the role of the church in this new era and how seminaries should prepare future leaders. Jesus calls us not to conform to the teachings of the Pharisees, particularly in the context of a nationalist Christianity that often co-opts his message for propaganda. Given that, what should those of us who follow Jesus do to ensure we are living out his teachings faithfully in today's world? And how can we discern if a place like AMBS is truly a saved place where these values are upheld?
Oof.
Wonderful question, Naun. Thank you.
Thank you, Naun. That's a big question, and some of which I think somebody else has to answer for us in terms of how are we an institution where we are saved from some of these influences? So, you never know who's going to show up at AMBS. This last couple of weeks, we've had visitors from Korea and South Africa and number of different countries. And this morning we had visitors from South Africa who I thought made such a profound statement to us about what we need to be doing at this particular time at AMBS in light of this very consequential election. And one of the things that one of the speakers gave us was the importance of silence and solidarity. That is engagement in solidarity with the oppressed and where injustice is happening, but also times of silence where we get away and reflect. These were disciples of Desmond Tutu, and they said that was definitely the dialectic of his life. So activism or engagement in solidarity by itself will lead us to burnout and can even lead us to forms of activism that don't take into account some of the unintended consequences that come with that. And so without that time of silence and retreat or reflection, we risk burnout, and we risk sort of losing track of ourselves and our identity and what we are really called to do as followers of Jesus. And I think at AMBS, in our whole pedagogical approach of knowing, doing, being, we're forming students in that way and making sure that our spirituality is as much a part of our work as our sociology, right? So how is our spirituality being nurtured to keep us grounded in our identity as followers of Jesus as we're engaging the world? I think there's lots of theological schools, lots of seminaries, I've been told this, where spirituality is often anemic in the pedagogy. And I think our pedagogical approach of knowing, there's a certain content you need to gain while you're in seminary, right? We're teaching content, but that's just one piece of a much larger process. What do you do with that content? How are you applying that content? And that's still not the end of the cycle. After you've applied the content, then ask the question, how do I bring what I know and what I've done back to my identity? And how is my identity being further developed as a follower of Jesus because of what I've learned and what I've done, so that I can re-enter that cycle at a always higher level? I think that's key in terms of how we face the headwinds of rising Christian nationalism and increasing secularization in our society. Keeping that dialectic going, always bringing us back, going out and doing, but coming back and reflecting. Action reflection is really critical, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking about just having read Parker Palmer's Courage to Teach and how much he stresses identity and integrity.
Right.
And you mentioned identity earlier as something that you heard in the Asian consultation. Why is the identity of the church so fragile? And I'm wondering, how do we foster identity of leaders? And
Mm-hmm.
hooking that back to what you started talking about, kind of this move towards a more functional view of what leaders give us. And
Mm-hmm.
we need to recover um, the identity, and that visioning is part of that, I think, as well.
Right.
I don't know if you want to say any more about that. And I also want to make sure people know you have a couple minutes here to add a question in the Q&A if you want to jump into this conversation as well. But I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, I think here's a place where we learn so much from our engagement in Ethiopia or Korea, or other places even. But places like Ethiopia, where the church is growing exponentially, it's often said that in Ethiopia, the Christian identity is a mile wide and an inch deep, right? Or the Anabaptist identity is a mile wide and an inch deep, just because the growth is so fast, no one can manage it, right? And so the students we're working with in Ethiopia on the ground there are these seasoned leaders. And I think the Ethiopian Masorete Christos Church has a real genius about how they're working at this identity development. And that is that we are invited to work at training people who are being groomed for regional leadership roles to be working at that formation more regionally with congregational leaders, so that they have a very systematic approach to trying to sort of knead this identity down into the local congregational context. And I think we ought to be thinking about what can we learn from that approach here. We tend to be so egalitarian here that we sometimes don't think about the very special role of seasoned leaders who can be coming alongside newer leaders um, to help deepen their identity. We do that through some forms of mentoring, and we have our own transition to ministry programs here at AMBS, that kind of thing. But I wonder if that couldn't be more robust. And I think we need elders, right? Like I remember Robert Bly's book, Sibling Society, where he was predicting that American culture would just be a culture of siblings where there are no longer elders. And I wonder if we ought to be a little more countercultural when it comes to identifying our elders among us who can help deepen that identity.
Thank you. Here's a question from Michelle Curtis. She says, I really appreciate your insight that critical thinking is a Western value rooted in individualism that's very important to our educational system. Can you put words to what values you see in communal cultures as essential in education? And I wonder what we might learn from a communal culture counterpart to critical thinking. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Good to hear from you. Thanks for joining us today. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've done some reading of dissertations who are, again, in sub-Saharan Africa working on this question. I think, first of all, we need to remember that the Bible, the stories we read in the Bible are coming from a culture that is much more communitarian than Western American culture. So reading the Bible through that lens is itself helpful. I think it's all about trying to understand ways of knowing. I mean, the fancy word for that is epistemology, right? What are ways of, how do people come to know in their context? And if you just start asking that question as you enter different cultural contexts, you can learn a lot. How did you come to know the things that you have come to know? And it's okay to question that, but there are ways of asking that question without doing damage or being hostile to the ways you've come to know. Here we tend to think, how did you come to know the things you know, and why should you think those things? And who says it has to be that way? And we get into this deconstructive thing. I think in some ways we also need to be, well, we do better to begin with a posture that says, how did you come to know the things you know in your context? And what's strong about that? How is that been the lifeline of how your culture and society has survived and thrived, before we ask the questions of what's wrong with that way of knowing, right? So I think that's the posture we're trying to take, is, and I've said this in other places, AMBS, as we're entering these other contexts and becoming more internationally engaged, we need to shift our own posture from being a steward of collecting Anabaptist theology here, or even exporting Anabaptist theology, and more a student of the phenomenon of how Anabaptist leadership and theology is being expressed in the world. So how could we become more of a student of the phenomenon? I think that sets us up to ask better questions when we're going into other contexts about how people come to know what they know, which is all related to critical thinking.
Well, thank you so much, David. We have come to the end of our time together, and it just kind of flew by. So I know people are going to be looking forward to reading what you write about your sabbatical experiences and maybe other opportunities to engage you in conversation. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you for your ongoing interest and support of AMBS. You'll notice in some of the emails that you've been getting that we are coming up on our season of giving, and we welcome your support financially here as we end this calendar year. And also, there are many classes being offered next semester. If you would like to use your graduate audit to participate in one of those, we welcome you to sign up to audit a class. You can talk to me about that if you have questions. Please continue to pray for AMBS. This is a very vibrant time in our life together, and there's so many wonderful things happening here. And we are so aware that it's the prayer support of the church that's having an impact on what's going on here. So thank you for that. We will not have a third Thursday in December, But in January, I will be talking with some of our alumni who are part of the Doctor of Ministry program during the week that they are here together on campus. We will have 3 cohorts going this year. We just learned that our 3rd cohort has a full complement of 10 students, some of whom are AMBS alumni. So you'll get to hear from AMBS alumni who are in the 1st cohort, the 2nd cohort, and the 3rd cohort about their experiences. And I hope you'll join us again the 3rd Thursday of January. Thank you so much to Faven for being our AV tech person today. I wish you all a blessed day and the rest of this year. Thank you.